Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. I'm here in New York City. So, welcome to another exciting talk in this series on famous women of American history. Our topic for today is one of the more colorful women of New York, in this case, Emma Goldman. And we are going to explore the darker side of the Gilded Age. Gilded Age, as you know, from the Civil War, about 1865, until World War I, 1914, a golden age of New York. But it was gilded, and that's a very important word. Well, on the right, you see a picture of me standing in Manhattan, and just once again admiring other buildings of New York City, the artwork. I'm a great passionate lover of New York City, and Emma Goldman is part of New York City history. Okay, here's the outline. As you can see, I'm still a university professor, even though I've retired. The glory of the Gilded Age. The New York City of Emma Goldman. What is to be done? Attempts at industrial and labor reform. And her contribution, the propaganda of the deed. And then the end of Golda, or end of Emma Goldman. Well, as we know, the Gilded Age was largely restricted to the wealthy Fifth Avenue people who made a fortune during the Civil War, moved to Fifth Avenue. So underneath this golden exterior was an ordinary person. Gilded Age is widely written. Edith Wharton, Mark Twain coined the term the Gilded Age in 1873, the very beginning of this very age. Other books, such as The Gilded Age, once again, 1876 to 1912. But the Gilded Age is very much in the news, as you can see from the recent HBO series, The Gilded Age, shows the conflict between old money, Astor, Schermerhorn, Stuyvesant, Fish, Delancey's, and the new money, those who made a fortune during the Civil War, the Vanderbilts, railroads, steamships, laymen, slave markets in the South, and then moving to the New York stock market. Guggenheim, Steinway, famous for his piano, but he was making cannons during the Civil War. Rockefeller, Carnegie Banking, Morgan Banking, the Belmont family. So when these new people, new money, who were the gilded ones, tried to force their way into the upper old money New York City, this was really a major chapter of the Gilded Age and of Emma Goldman, well presented in the HBO series The Gilded Age. Fifth Avenue was mansions. It was beautiful churches. It was men in top hats. It was absolutely magnificent. Few of these mansions remain. On the right, we see one, which is at 82nd Street, built in 1901, towards the end of the Gilded Age, by the brothers William and Thomas Hall. But it is still standing there, and you can see how opulent it was for one family. Mrs. Astor ruled the Gilded Age. Her mansion in Rhode Island could hold 400 comfortably for dinner. Many of the wealthy New York families sent their daughters to Europe where they would marry dukes, princes, archdukes, barons to get a royal title because royal titles were forbidden according to the American Constitution. Well, that was the Gilded Age that we all know and love and features in HBO movies and everything else. But there was another New York. These were the people who waited on tables, who cleaned the toilets, who sewed the beautiful dresses for ladies, who cut the men's beards. And this was a very different, these were the working people. Emma Goldman was born in St. Petersburg, a Jewish family. If they were living in St. Petersburg, that meant that they were well-to-do. As you can see from the picture, most Jews were living in small villages and towns in the Pale, where the Jews were restricted. But certain court Jews, certain powerful Jews, were permitted to live in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Well, actually, she was born in Lithuania, which was part of the Russian Empire, 1869. And family moved to St. Petersburg, very successful. And she moved to New York in 1885 at the age of 16. So she was a very independent person. As you can see from the picture, the X, that is Emma Goldman. Everybody else is sitting comfortably in a family unit, and you see her leaning to the side as if she is not quite a member of the family. Well, Russia was awash with revolutionary movements. Marxism and Engels had convinced many Russians that revolution was the only way to improve Russia, to make Russia equal, to get rid of the wealthy elite at the top and topple them and have the workers come to power. So, among the Jewish intellectuals and working people, socialism was the answer. Israel was being established. Tel Aviv in 1909 was founded by socialists. They considered religion, Jewish religion, as an opiate of the people, a drug to keep you quiet and docile. They demanded total freedom, the overthrow of governments, the rule of the workers, not kings and aristocrats, and in the case of New York, the gilded Fifth Avenue people. They wanted to overcome ethnic, religious, and linguistic differences. Whatever language, culture, religion you had, you should come together to create this new, wonderful world, a utopia. And so this was very much her upbringing. Revolution would solve the world's problems. Well, when she came in the early 1900s, there was a high point of American immigration. If you look at the graph, you can see that these were Europeans. In 1900, predominantly Italians and Eastern Europeans, Poles and Czechs, Jews, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, were flocking into the United States, the largest period of immigration until the present. And then World War I came, immigration declined to 1930, where there was almost no immigration. That's the golden age of Donald Trump. When he says, make America great again, that means get rid of all these Jews, these Muslims, these Africans, these Chinese and Koreans and Mexicans and Argentinians. So New York was a boom city, especially during World War I, when industry was what it was all about. Southern Italians, Eastern Europeans flocked through Ellis Island. Well, earlier, before Ellis Island was built in 1900, people went through Castle Garden, which is at the bottom of Manhattan. So New York was booming. But at the same time, there was anti-immigrant hysteria. Thomas Nast, a German Protestant origin, came and was appalled by all of these dirty Catholics and Jews and Italians flocking into the nice Protestant America. In fact, in 1882, Congress passed a law that banned Asian immigration entirely. And so the atmosphere in New York was all of these immigrants flocking into the Lower East Side, Chinatown, Little Italy's, were ruining this nice white Protestant America. We hear echoes of Donald Trump through all of this. Saturday Evening Post and had articles, Americans of today and tomorrow. What was America going to be? Jews were especially criticized. Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews were flocking into the Lower East Side. So there was a vicious anti-immigration movement. The Italians were considered colored people because they were dark-skinned Southern Italians. Well, of course, people fought back. You had the German Harmony Club, founded in 1852, for good quality German-speaking Jews. None of this Eastern European what the Jews called the Ostjuden, or more precisely, the verdammte Ostjuden, the damn Eastern European Jews. So even amongst the Jews, there was vicious racism against the Lower East Side with their Yiddish and all of their superstitions and funny clothes, whereas the German Jews were largely assimilated and had no love for all of these people who they barely considered Jewish. Diseases were spreading, cholera, various other diseases, tuberculosis, poisoned water, epidemics were rampant among the lower classes of New York. Famous book by Jacob Riis from Denmark, How the Other Half Lives, in 1890, popularized the fate of the lower classes. What is to be done? Well, with all of these Eastern European Jews coming in, many German Jews from Upper Manhattan. By then, we had the first Temple Emmanuel on Fifth Avenue at 42nd Street, which was the first Fifth Avenue synagogue of the Reform Jews, of the German Jews. Well, some of these well-to-do German Jews from Upper Manhattan decided that they had to assimilate these Eastern European Jews. They couldn't ignore them. So they built the Educational Alliance on East Broadway, which taught these new immigrants how to type, bookkeeping, good English, how to dress properly, how to speak properly, how to become nurses, how to become professional people in this new world. And of course, it taught them to abandon all of these rituals and superstitions of the Orthodox Jews and become Reform Jews. Eat what you want, dress the way you want, and chart your own life. Get out of the ghetto and join America. Same thing as the YMCA, doing the exact same thing. Reform society, prison reform, opening public schools to educate the young people into American values. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, that my great aunt Ella was one of the main figures in that. And architecture reform. We see at the bottom on the right, we see the layout of apartments, so that in the middle of the apartment there would be an open courtyard with windows, so that there would be ventilation in the apartments, especially in the cooking areas and the bathroom areas. Sanitation reform. Well, Emma Goldman was part of this acute awareness of the lower classes. Other Jews from wealthy German families also were part of this. Felix Adler was part of this reform movement. Well, he was kicked out of Temple Emmanuel, where his father was rabbi, because he gave his first sermon as an ordained rabbi and didn't mention the word God once. So the synagogue said, how can you preach a sermon in a synagogue and not mention God? And he said, I don't believe in God. I believe that Jews are an ethical people and their duty is to reform society. And so Emma and people like Felix Adler were very much involved in this reform movement. Felix Adler founded the Ethical Culture Society, believing in education. Whereas Emma Goldman, as you can see from the picture on the left, believed in anarchism, feminism, socialism, and communism. Revolution, overthrow the government, seize the mansions of the rich on Fifth Avenue, divide them into apartments for the homeless and for the poor and for new immigrants. This is called the progressive era of reform, police reform, educational reform, political reform. And people like Ida Tarbell, again, waging war against the Fifth Avenue Standard Oil multi-billionaires. Lillian Wald, another family of very wealthy German Jews in Upper Manhattan, established the Henry Street Settlement House in the heart of the Lower East Side to improve health conditions among these new immigrants. So it was an age of reform. Emma Goldman, speaking Russian, speaking Yiddish, speaking German, and then English, started writing articles in the German newspaper, the Yiddish newspaper, and giving speeches. Every woman should have the right to say whether she shall have a child or not. Motherhood should be a voluntary act, not an act of a slave. Well, you can imagine what people would reacted when they heard that. A child was a gift of God. You didn't interfere with the plan of God. God wanted you to get pregnant. Well, you got pregnant. There was no birth control, no abortion. And Emma Goldman demanded the liberation of women. Well, she was also very powerful in industrial and labor reform. During the Gilded Age, New York was a powerhouse of industry. Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago were still emerging during this period, but it was New York that during the Civil War had produced the steel. It was the Brooklyn Naval Yards that built the ships, and New York was filled with factories. Her answer was anarchism. Remove the powerful from the top and replace them with committees so that if there was a factory, the factory workers would form a committee. They would run the factory, not some wealthy person on Fifth Avenue who was in cahoots with the mayor, the state government, and federal government. Sweatshops, child labor were very important. Child labor was very important because children had small fingers. They could do sewing. They could work on factories. And of course, many of them lost their fingers at these factories. And of course, there was no Social Security. There was no insurance. You lost your finger, you lost your job, and nobody cared. Well, of course, there was resistance in 1886, the famous Haymarket riot strike in Chicago, where the workers rose in revolt. Here you see the poster on the left in English and in German. The workers rose in revolt against their bad working conditions. Very often it was 6 hours a day, 10 days a week, no vacation, no insurance, no retirement. When business was bad, their salary went down. Well, on May 4th, that's the origin of May Day, 1886, someone threw a bomb during one of the strikes. And it resulted in 8 deaths, over 70 injuries. 100 strikers were arrested. Their leaders were executed. And it just shows how difficult the working conditions were. Here we see the four being marched to the gallows to be hung. The other leaders were commemorated by other working people as demanding freedom. The goal was 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours of relaxation. Well, this day in May is celebrated around the world as Labor Day, International Labor Day. Of course, the United States wants to forget that sordid chapter of its history, so we have our own Labor Day in September, which has absolutely nothing to do with labor anymore. We have it in September 5th, when it was established in 1882 as the American Labor Day. Homestead strike in Pittsburgh, July to November 1892. Again, strikes. The Army's National Guard was called in. Pinkerton's detective agency was called in to break up the strikes, break up the riots. 12-hour gunfight. 7 guards and 9 strikers were killed. Situation was dire in the late 1800s for the working class. Well, Emma Goldman's goal was to resist. She was an eloquent speaker and gave many speeches. She was a journalist and wrote, but she also believed in the propaganda of the deed, fighting violence with violence, blood with blood. And so she became a major figure in the anarchist movement. Liberation of the human mind from the domination of religious priests and rabbis and other charlatans. Liberation of the human body from the coercion of property. Liberation from the shackles and restraint of governments. Free groupings of individuals. Well, she was a great advocate for birth control, begun by the pioneer Margaret Sanger. She was an advocate of abortion. She believed that pornography within limits was acceptable. She believed in women's sexual liberation. Well, the government was not very happy with all of this, and so they passed the infamous Comstock Act, which made it illegal to send anything obscene through the post office. Now, obscene here means talking about birth control, talking about abortion, pornography, or even sexuality in general. And this is a way that the government was fighting back against everything she was advocating for. She believed in total freedom, free love, birth control, freedom from government regulations, from religious domination, from the male chauvinist rule of the family, from racism, whites over blacks, from poverty, wealthy on Fifth Avenue, the impoverished masses in slums, freedom from disease, the pandemics, the epidemics that flooded the city. So she believed that the wealthy of Fifth Avenue were not going to give up their power and their money, and that the only thing they could do was to fight back. Well, during the Homestead strike, her lover at the time, Alexander Berkman, entered the office of Henry Clay Frick, who was the chairman of Carnegie Steel Corporation, shot him 3 times, and stabbed him with a knife. This was propaganda of the deed. Of course, it was all over the newspapers. Books were being written, speeches were being given condemning this, what today we'd call terrorism, but it was the resistance of the weak against the power of the rich. And so this was very much supported by her. Now, we don't know for sure to what extent Emma was involved in it, but of course, Alexander was her lover. And the anarchists, the other labor organizers, the workers strongly supported this act to show that the lower classes were being ruthlessly exploited by the wealthy and that something had to be done. Now, don't forget, at the same time in Russia, they were having the same situation. And what did the Russians do after World War I? They rose in revolt. They murdered the royal family. They expelled the aristocrats. And it was total revolution. And many people were afraid that the same thing would happen in the United States if there was no reform. Berkman was sentenced to 22 years in prison, where he wrote his memoirs. Alexander Berkman shows his mug shot, and he was, condemned in the press as a violent revolutionary, a terrorist. And Emma Goldman was arrested as well, even though he was clearly guilty, witnesses, but her involvement was never clear, although she probably supported it. But whether she bought a gun or anything, that we have no idea. He was a writer. Here we see him, and as a revolutionary, the ABC of anarchism, how to overthrow the government, to take power to the people. Well, the situation was getting dire in New York during the Panic of 1893. Tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs. Of course, there was no Social Security then. There was no unemployment benefits. You lost your job, you did what you could to survive. You didn't have money to pay your rent, you were kicked out, and you, your wife, and your children lived on the streets. And so the Berkman assassination attempt was a sign of the times that was only getting worse. Well, Emma Goldman was arrested, and finally they decided to charge her with inciting to riot. Here again, it was not something she did, but it was what she said, her writings. There you see the picture of her. She spent 1 year in prison on Blackwell's Island Penitentiary. Her goal was take everything by force because the wealthy of Fifth Avenue were not going to give up their luxurious lifestyle to improve the lives of other people. The situation didn't get any worse when it was President McKinley's assassination in 1901 in Buffalo by what people called an anarchist. Mother Earth magazine was founded by Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, which exists until today. Articles calling for violence revolution. They organized the No Conscription League during World War I. Resist the draft. She was finally arrested on June 15th, 1917. This is during World War One. World War One is 14 to 18. The United States had entered it. The war finally, now according to the Espionage Act of 1917, she was arrested for espionage and calling for revolution. Donald Trump today is using the Espionage Act to silence critiques of the Trump government. And uh, has brought a lot of charges against journalists and people who leak information from government. The very same act that Emma Goldman was arrested and convicted to 2 years in prison for. Well, anarchists and communists were, in the eyes of most people, inseparable. So she was expelled from the United States after 2 years in prison and sent to Russia, where by 1917, the communists had seized power. Lenin was in power, and the Russian Revolution was raging. Europe had to complete rearranging of the map. The German, the Austrian, the Turkish empires disappeared. The Russian Empire disappeared, and Russia was taken over by the communists who, in the 17s, 18s, 19s, and 20s, were still struggling to conquer all of Russia, the Russian Civil War. The United States went into panic drive and was terrified that the communists would take over in the United States. There was a communist uprising in Bavaria, in Germany. There were uprisings in Hungary, in China. The communist government was taking shape. The business situation was not getting much better. The famous Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York, where um, um, hundreds of young girls in a Triangle factory couldn't escape the building and died. 141 men and women die in this terrible fire. Well, after 2 years in prison, Emma Goldman was expelled. In 1919, she was deported back to Russia, from whence she had come. Well, in the Russian Civil War, the situation was very, very bad. She wrote about the Spanish Civil War that was going on and really was not very happy with the situation in Russia. And eventually, she became disillusioned with the Russian Revolution. Situation in the United States, 21, Sachem and Vicente, again arrested and executed for their revolutionary activities. Then came the Great Depression, a horrendous fear by the American government that American Revolution would happen and the communists would take over. So the communist fear was still very much an obsession for the United States. Eventually, she found her way to Canada, where on May 14th, 1939, in the midst of the Great Depression, she died. Here is her tomb in Toronto, Canada, which commemorates her wonderful and creative and controversial life. Eventually, President FDR came to power and realized that something must be done. He was the one who gave us Social Security. He's the one who allowed unions to organize and bargain collectively. And it is said that due to FDR, that revolution was averted in the United States. So her programs, her plans, her fears spurred a major reaction, and a revolution was averted in the United States. Well, that's me again on the right in the Lower East Side. One of the buildings is the apartment of buildings, you can call them that, right across the street from the Eldridge Street Synagogue. And this is really a major location in the history of the labor movement because Jews like Emma Goldman ended up mobilizing the working poor. Strikes, of course, were ruthlessly suppressed. People like Jacob Riis ended up writing books, How the Other Half Lives. And luckily, because of the alarms set off by people like Emma Goldman, a communist regime in the United States was averted, and the United States under FDR was able to avoid a revolution, which was occurring in Russia, which would eventually occur in China and many other countries. So the United States was able to escape this. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the talk and hope to see you later in the future for another exciting talk by your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown.